It's Black History Month, and for some of you may know that my other role when I'm not here is I'm the Black Liaison Officer for Offenders. And February is a busy month for me because apparently I'm the expert now on Black history. And so I've gone to different locations to share some of that history. It's a delight because there are things that perhaps if you never come across those stories, you'll just be ignorant of them. You won't know any of that. And so I think the reason why we have this history event this afternoon is to bring these things to your mind. My week was quite interesting because it began with I was invited to a presentation done by now we call them these days Inuit or an Inuk. And so this lady was from the north, way up in the north, the Arctic Circle. And she says that to be politically correct, that's what they've done, is change the name, so they didn't want to sound as though they were insulting. But she referred to herself as an Isikisimo, somebody from the north who eats raw meat. That's what it literally means. And she's proud to wear that. But for the first 20 minutes of her presentation, she spoke to us in Inuktitut. 20 minutes. And of course, when she started speaking, you thought she'd stop and then give it a translation. She never did. But it was by design, because she said, how did it feel in that 20 minutes? Not knowing what's being said. And then, of course, you could feel the atmosphere change, because she says that's what happened to that community and to the indigenous people when they were told, don't speak your language and learn a new language that they didn't know and they had no idea. So I thought, how profound and how deep was that impression on my heart? And I thought, wow, there's a lot of things that we have done as human beings to other human beings. We thought it was in their best interest, but we never entered into their world to find out, what does that really mean? Guess what? I'm back in Ephesians. It's taken a while to get here, isn't it? Wow. Ephesians, if I can summarize for you, has got 6 chapters and can be divided into 3 portions. Sit, walk, stand. The sit part is just sit down and listen to that which has been done on your behalf. Chapters 1, 2, and 3 talk about what Christ accomplished. We didn't even ask for it. He did all of these things just for us. And then chapter 4 and 5 are about the walk. Now, not the walk, because everybody's got their own walk. It's the lifestyle, how we should then live. And then chapter 6 is taking the stand against the true enemy, because human beings are not our enemies. They are not our enemies. There's a spiritual realm that impresses itself upon us and encourages us to look at somebody else and see that I don't think they like me. And they give us the impression that the person that doesn't look like me, doesn't sound like me, is my enemy. So I think the book of Ephesians is appropriate for the whole community of faith. And so I've chosen a passage from chapter 4. In the NIV it says, instructions for Christian living. That's very nice. So this is for you. Instructions for Christian living. While I'm turning there, we're in the season of Epiphany. Do you know what Epiphany is? Anybody? Yeah, I thought so. Epiphany is bringing to light or manifesting something divine. That's the very simplest thing, because January 6th is Epiphany Day, and it's traditionally thought that that's kind of the time when the Magi showed up to see Jesus. Now I want you to think of this, that here were people from a very different culture, and through their study, through all of their observations of life, had a sense that something unique was going on over in Israel. And so they wanted to go see what this was all about. And so their culture was moved by the appearance of this one called Jesus. And when they saw him, that's when they saw this divine thing that was promised to them. There was an epiphany. The next time we understand the epiphany was when Jesus was baptized in the Jordan River, because after he was baptized, it says a voice came from heaven and spoke. So can you imagine being in the audience there and you hear this and you think, oh, that's cool. This person was just being baptized and all of a sudden we hear this earth-shaking voice affirming him. And then, when I preached the last time, we talked about when Jesus turned water into wine. I mean, it was very clear that Jesus came from a very different place. And he came to be with the people at his time to show to them that life can be lived from a different frame of reference. And you know what? He came to leave an example for us so you and I could also live from a different frame of reference. So let's go there. Ephesians 4, verse 17 says, so I tell you this, and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their thinking. Let me just bring some clarity. Paul refers to the Gentiles, and he was the apostle to the Gentiles, but I'd like you to get a better understanding. He's not talking about a people's group, like some culture group over there. He's talking about unbelievers. Don't live as the unbelievers do, people who tend to have no sort of purpose in life, in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity, and they are full of greed. It's quite an indictment on the unbeliever in Jesus' day. And might I say, that indictment still sits today on people who don't have a faith in anything but pursue that which makes them happy, what satisfies their senses. We know people that are like that. Perhaps we were like that once, is what Paul would say. That, however, is not the way of life you have learned. When you heard about Christ and were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus, you were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, and to be made new in the attitude of your minds. Put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. I'd like to focus on that statement that just comes before that in verse 23. To be made new in the attitude of your minds. So that's what the NIV says. The King James says to renew in the spirit of your mind. Did you know your mind has a spirit? What on earth does that mean? And I'm glad you asked the question. Let's see if I can answer that for you. And he encourages the Ephesian community to renew the spirit of their mind. What is the spirit of the mind? I think some time ago, maybe over a year ago, I mentioned this word, Zeitgeist. You understand what it's a German word. It's a compound word, Zeit meaning spirit, and Geist meaning, Zeit meaning time, and Geist meaning spirit. So in other words, it's the spirit of the age. Zeitgeist. It's just a beautiful capturing of, and we have had several things in our lifetime, and also in the lifetime of the world, periods and eras where there's been sort of a spirit that informs the minds of people. You understand what I'm saying? Let me just take us back to the last century. I can say that. I was born in the last century. Yeah, I can say that now. In the 20th century. We know that right at the onset of the 20th century, World War I was sort of, it came into being, where there was a great conflict that was going on, and it affected many, many countries. Following World War I, there was another period that came, and that was called the Great Depression. Some of us weren't around in there, and I wasn't around in the Great Depression. But I've heard stories about what it was like. And after the Great Depression, in fact, it almost seemed this ended the Great Depression, was World War II. A conflict arose again. And that lasted a period of time. That was quickly followed by the Cold War. And the Cold War lasted for several decades. And the Cold War also brought about a certain kind of sense that we lived in. I know I was born in the period of the Cold War. There you are. You can tell how old I am now. Here you are. This is the idea that I had developed during that zeitgeist, that in Russia, the president over there had a big desk, and on his desk there was a button. And in a similar way, in the United States, on the president's desk, there was a button there too, and it says, push this in case of emergency. And that button was, launch a nuclear weapon at the enemy. And I lived in fear that somehow one of those guys is going to push that button. But they never did. Instead, when conflicts arose, each of these two were involved in those conflicts on one side or the other of the issue, and they fought each other through those means. But it's a Cold War. It was a war that was being fought, but we're not so sure what is going to happen. There's the zeitgeist. Do you understand by that? So let me just give a better illustration, because just in case it hasn't fully landed on you. In the period of the Cold War, the Vietnam War showed up as well. And there was the draft policies in the U.S. to get people to go to that war. And I came to Canada in 1990 and had the opportunity in 91 to go to Vancouver, and then to Vancouver Island, and then from Vancouver Island to the little Gulf Islands. And I felt that the more I was going west, the further back in time I was going. Because when I got to those little Gulf Islands, I found people there, hippies. I know. And as I tried to find out, how did you end up here? Because it's like in the middle of nowhere. They said, well, we're descendants of those folks that we didn't want to go to war. They adopted peace as their frame of reference and didn't want to be drafted. And so they found a place that they could be where nobody would harass them. And they've lived from that perspective. So what I'm saying is, when there's a zeitgeist or a spirit that sort of governs people for a period of time, it affects countries, nations, communities, and families. And it's our interaction with the zeitgeist that develops the spirit of our mind. It's coming closer to you. I think it's going to land. Let me use a personal story for you. When I was growing up, there was a great speech delivered by the British Prime Minister in Cape Town, South Africa in 1960, October I think it was, 1960, and he talked about the wind of change that was blowing through the British Empire at the time. And the wind of change meant that we're going to have to give back to the places where we have colonized government to the local people. And when he finished that speech, the South African people gripped tighter onto their rules, and they banned any political movement that was against them. Just north of South Africa is Zimbabwe, where I'm from. The wind of change blew, but they put a wind, like a wind blockage, because it never affected us at all. Countries were taking independence, Nigeria, Ghana, all the way through. And when it came just to north of us to Zambia in 1964, I was 1 year old. I can remember the jubilation that was running through the streets when Zambia became independent and people were free from colonial leadership. But I was born in Zimbabwe, and in fact, they made a declaration against the United Kingdom and said, we're going to do our own thing. And they had a unilateral declaration, and they governed in this rebellious way. And that's the zeitgeist I was raised in. where we were still under colonial rule, but they made it more difficult for us. But of course, you can only put people down so long. And what started to happen, there were uprisings that were coming in from the indigenous population, where they would do some destabilizing acts. They'd burn a factory, blow up a bridge, to let the people know your country is not going to be restful until you give it back to us. And for 15 years, we were subject to this kind of atmosphere. That's the zeitgeist that I was raised in. And then, to further that, my mother, who has 5 kids, I'm the middle of 5, decided to send the 3 older ones off to boarding school when I was 9 years old. And I went to the boarding school, and this is the law. I don't know, there are some in this congregation that probably had this as a rule. Children are seen and not heard. We make decisions on behalf of the children, so they just have to know we have their best interests at heart. And so I think that's what governed my parents' mind when they did that. And so for the next 7 years after I was sent to boarding school, I was in the boarding school. I'd only come up home for about a month at a time. 3 months away, 1 month at home, 3 months away. So what my mother didn't realize and probably had to reflect on was I was spending more time elsewhere than with her. So the rules and the regulations and all of the things that was impacting me was coming from somewhere else and no longer from her. And this came really to a head in 1993 when we were here in Canada, when my mother paid a visit to us. And she paid a visit in response to an article that I wrote. And the article said this: when my wife and I, came to Canada in 1990, we had 2 children, 4.5 and 3 years old. And in Zimbabwe, we had a servant to take care of them. Like, we only went and kissed them goodnight after they were fed and bathed. That was good. And we spent a bit of time with them on the weekends, but boy, we didn't have that kind of responsibility. And then we came to Canada, and they were with us 24/7, the whole time. We were at a loss initially, but we had to adjust. And so the article said that we came from a culture where children are raised by the extended family and servants, and it was hard for us to come to terms with this new reality, but we did. And of course, it was published in the magazine, and I gave magazines to my family. And my mother got a hold of this magazine, and she read it, and she saw the insult in there. You can understand, she felt insulted. And she wanted to come make it right with me. And so she made the trip. Can you imagine? I'm sure you'd have liked to be there in this encounter. But the sad point of that encounter was the last time I was fully under the influence of my mother was when I was 9 years old. I was now a man with a family of 2 kids and a wife. And she had no frame of reference to connect with me that way. And so it was clear for me to let her know that I have lived very differently than she had ever thought I would. And I said that it all came from a decision you made those years ago. You did it, and you thought it was for our good. But there was a consequence that occurred. I grew apart from you, and I grew in a different way. And if she could accept my truth at that time, we could start our relationship from that point on, from a place of truth. So the zeitgeist in my family was that. But what was happening in the spirit of my mind, I had to deal, first of all, with the separation when I was 9 years old. I had to deal with the fact that my mom, I wouldn't see her for 3 months. The regular interaction that I would have daily with her never occurred, and I had to go to the emotional place of disconnecting myself from that. My spirit of my mind had to deal with the fact that I first of all felt rejected. Do you get what I'm saying? I first felt rejected. But then I had to find a new place to do what they expected me in this new place. And they formed and they shaped me. And they formed and shaped me with all interesting ways. Corporal punishment was a regular administration. And yes, I was raised by the rod. That's why I became a pastor. I shouldn't say that. But in other words, they had ways of keeping you within the lines. So the point is this: how do we relate this passage to us? Well, I thought I'd give you a biblical example. The story goes from Genesis chapter 37 to Genesis 45, the story of that boy called Joseph. Joseph was called by his brothers the dreamer, because Joseph was the oldest son of Jacob's favorite wife. That story in itself is very interesting because Jacob loved Rachel, and when he went to her father to ask her for marriage, he said, yeah, you can marry her. And then, of course, when all the celebrations were done, and it's interesting how they do this marriage ritual, when the wife is brought to his tent, it's nighttime, there's no lights like this, and in the morning he wakes up and it ain't Rachel in the bed with him. It's Leah, it's the older sister. Can you imagine what that was like? But he went back to the father-in-law, said, I didn't sign up for this. Oh, our custom, he says, is we have to give the older daughter first. If you want to marry Rachel, you got to work 7 more years for me. And so the one with whom he loved, he could only get her after all these conditions. And then she bore him the son Joseph. And you can imagine that he is the oldest and firstborn of the woman that he loved, and he became a favorite. And he had other sons already, but this was his favorite. And the boys knew that. I mean, when Christmas time would come or whenever big celebrations would come, they would go down to Value Village and get all the stuff for the boys, but Jacob would make a special robe just for his son, handmade, of all the different colors. You can tell that the family was starting to pay attention to this. And because of this, they hated him all the more. And they hated him so much that they wanted to kill him. But thankfully, God intervened, because one of the brothers said, you don't do us any good. Let's just get rid of him. There's a traveling camel train that's going off to Egypt. Let's sell him, get some money for him. And they sold him into slavery. Off he went. And when he went and got to Egypt, you'd think perhaps he'd be adopted by some kind people, etc. No, he was a slave now. So he was sold into the service of the general, say, of the army. And the general's wife set him up and accused him of something he never did, and he ended up going to jail. And he served quite a bit of time, probably 7 to 10 years. I don't know, the time doesn't say. But here he was in jail. Just the other day, he had good dreams about his brother and about how he's going to be important to the family, and they didn't like that. They just put him into a caravan and sent him off to Egypt, and he's sitting in isolation, disconnected from his family, and wondering, how did I get here? So what do you think he was thinking of, the spirit of his mind at that time? Anybody, just tell me, if it was you, how would you be processing that? What would you think about? It's okay, you can talk to me.
I think the overriding emotion would have been, but I didn't do anything to deserve this.
Yeah. Certainly he's feeling sorry for himself, no doubt about that. Sense of rejection, sense of not belonging anywhere. And then, of course, now he's in jail and he has to, he's got to do something, walk in the guidelines set by the prison system. But something was with him. I like that song, There Was Another in the Fire. That song must have been, I think, the idea of that song must have stayed close to Joseph's heart, because there was somebody there with him. And he excelled in everything that he did, so much so that he was made in charge of other prisoners. The gifts were recognized in him, and he was truly an interpreter of dreams. And through that gift, he was brought into the Pharaoh's presence to interpret a dream the Pharaoh's having a difficulty with. The whole story is extraordinary, because after he interpreted the dream for the Pharaoh says, you know something? I recognize there's something in you, something extraordinary, and you believe that God was with him. I'm going to promote you to Prime Minister of Egypt, a prisoner to the Prime Minister. And so God had certainly helped him come into the place where he had great influence in Egypt. And of course, there was a drought that was affecting not only Egypt, but the area. And who would be affected by the drought? Yeah, those boys that sent him into slavery. So, when we see the story unfolding, we can see that Joseph, when he sees his brothers I don't know what that was like. The scripture tries to paint a picture for us. And you could tell that his heart was moved and he wanted to reach out and embrace them, but he resisted that. And he had already learned Egyptian, so he sounded like a foreigner to them. And he engaged through an interpreter with them. But that was an encounter, and he ran them through some interesting tasks. And I think that was just to satiate the spirit of his mind at the time, because he knew that they really, they did what they did out of selfishness and hatred. But he also knew that they probably didn't know what they were doing, but he needed to let them feel it a little bit. Now, I don't know if you've ever done that to anybody that you know. You know, even though you could say, it's okay, you didn't hurt me, you just, first of all, you drag out the situation for another day or a week, just to let them stew in it a bit. We human beings are like that, are we not? Yeah, but anyway, let's get on with the story. But after letting him run through this difficult thing, he really comes to himself. And let's go to Genesis 45. Oops. I know it's in here somewhere. Verse 1. Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Everyone, leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and the Pharaoh's household heard about it. So the brothers were brought into this room, and there were servants there, and he says, "Clear the room." And he's just alone with his brothers. And you can imagine the brothers, having been put through these tests, were thinking this is going to be the end for sure. You know, now they're going to come and march them all out under the sword and be executed, because they had a sense that somewhere along the way they are now being punished for that terrible thing that they did to their brother. But what is going to happen? You can see what was in the spirit of their mind. Joseph said to his brothers, "I'm Joey. I'm Joseph." And he said it in their language. "Is my father still alive?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. And when they had done so, he said, I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now don't be distressed. Don't be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save you that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there's been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there will be no plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve you, a remnant on earth, to save your lives by a great deliverance. Joseph had to deal with the spirit of his mind through that terrible time that he experienced, to the place where he could hear from God that all of these things didn't happen because these guys had this selfish ambition or selfish desire. I was leading you through those circumstances to be where you are so you can bring salvation to your family. So when we go back to the passage that I just read in Ephesians, talking about how do we renew the spirit of your mind. There are things that in Romans chapter 12, it talks about, I beseech you therefore, present your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to the Lord, which is your reasonable act of service. Don't be conformed to the pattern of this world. That pattern of this world, that's the zeitgeist. Those are the things that are impacting us every day, and we develop inside of us a response to that. And how we respond. For instance, can you remember COVID? Of course, who can't forget COVID? The zeitgeist It lasted for about 3 years with us. And what did we do? We went and bought toilet paper, didn't we? We did. I don't know why. But that wasn't the only thing, because as rules were being placed and as edicts were being announced, we found out some responded to them in this way: oh, they're taking away our freedom. You heard that, didn't you? And the others were saying, I'm so glad that they're making these decisions, because they are vulnerable people that can't make decisions for themselves. And so they're cutting these lines up to create some safety. There were two different perspectives that came out of that, weren't there? And so that was the zeitgeist, but the spirit of our minds drew a line where we said, I'm not going to let them do this to me. Some of us said that. And others said, oh, we're glad that they're creating a safe space for us. Both experiencing the same thing, but with different results. The point is this: if we try to live by the standards of the world, we will be pushed backwards and forwards. Absolutely no doubt about that. And so this is why when Christ came and demonstrated to us a way to live, and He gave us a new way, and He gave us a guarantee of living that way by His Spirit, there is a way we can respond, and that is His way. Yes. Because this is what it says here. You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, and to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. Every day when you change your clothes, when you put off the old clothes for the day and you go to sleep and you put on new ones, He's using this illustration so that He knows that every day when we change, we should have this in mind. What are you putting on today? What attitude in your mind will be there? Will it be the attitude of Christ? Or will it be the attitude of, I'm not so sure I can make it through the day? If only that neighbor stops putting that music so loud. We're affected by things, but we should have a better response than the one sometimes we do come up with. My prayer for you and for me is that we experience a renewal in the spirit of our minds and put off the old, put off those things that make us concerned about how different we are, but let's put on the new that make us see with Christ's eyes the love and compassion that needs to be shared with those who don't know. Let us pray. Father, thank you for your word to our hearts today. Thank you that you still are interested in us, and you've given us the guarantee for us to live into the reality that you've created for us. In the book of Romans chapter 8, it says the whole creation waits in eager expectation for the manifestation of the children of God. I'll say it in words that we can understand. Waits in eager expectation for the epiphany of the children of God. So that in our obedience and the strength of the Spirit that works in us, we can actually bring about your eternal purposes here and now. So help us to put off the things that prevent us from doing that and put on the things that enable us to do so. We thank you, dear God, for your word to our hearts. In Jesus' name, amen.
Let's stand and sing our final song together. I love you, Lord.
All my days I've been held in your hand.